Norway's trillion-dollar problem. Want to know where capitalism's future lies? Forget New York, forget London. Look north to a tiny frozen country near the Arctic Circle. They've accomplished something every nation dreams about. They've gotten so wealthy they can't fail. But maybe they're so rich they can't survive either. Norway breaks all the economic rules of our century. Just 5.5 million people live there, yet they control the biggest sovereign wealth fund on Earth. We're talking about $1.6 trillion sitting in their bank account. Think about that for a second. If they emptied that fund right now and split it equally, back in 1969, when Norway's economy was struggling, Phillips Petroleum hid oil in the North Sea's Ekofisk field. This was one of history's biggest offshore discoveries. But here's where Norway's story gets interesting. Unlike Venezuela, Nigeria, or Saudi Arabia, they didn't let oil money corrupt their democracy. They avoided what we call the resource curse. They didn't blow the cash on golden palaces or build up some massive army. What they did was shockingly boring but incredibly smart. They saved every penny. They built something called the Government Pension Fund Global, their famous oil fund. Then they made a rule called the Handlingsregelen. This rule says the government can only spend the interest the fund earns, about 3% each year. The main pile of money, untouchable? This was their strategy to stop inflation and make sure oil money would last forever. They turned a limited resource into permanent wealth. Sounds like a perfect success story, right? But underneath this wealthy paradise, something toxic is growing. It's a new version of an old economic disease. Here's Norway's problem in simple terms. When the government becomes independently rich, its people become dependent. The government has endless oil money to cover any budget shortfall. So the pressure to be efficient? Gone. Norway's public sector has exploded into one of the world's biggest compared to their economy size. About 30% of workers are employed by the government. Add in people on disability, sick leave, and pensions, and you'll find a shocking percentage of Norwegians depend directly on the oil fund just to survive day to day. This creates what I call golden handcuffs in their job market. Why would anyone work 60-hour weeks building a startup when government jobs offer great pay, long vacations, and total job security? Why risk innovation when the safety net feels more like a comfortable bed? Growth and productivity for their mainland economy, everything except oil, has completely stalled. Norway is splitting into two economies. There's the hugely profitable oil sector paying for everything. Then there's the slow, expensive mainland economy that barely produces anything the world wants to buy. Remove oil from the equation, and Norway runs a massive trade deficit. Basically, it's a country living off grandpa's allowance. But the contradiction gets even darker when you examine the moral angle. Norway sees itself as a humanitarian champion. They lead the world in fighting climate change. They push electric vehicles harder than anyone else. A massive 80% of new cars sold there are EVs, all heavily subsidized by the government. But here's the question: where does that subsidy money come from? It comes from selling the exact fossil fuels causing the climate crisis. Norway lives in total contradiction. They're like the world's biggest drug dealer who uses profits to fund rehab centers. They ship millions of barrels of oil to Europe and Asia, pumping up global emissions so they can feel good about driving Teslas in Oslo. This double standard is getting harder to ignore. Young climate activists are taking the government to court to stop Arctic drilling. International courts are questioning whether their oil exports are even moral. The oil fund itself owns 1.5% of every stock globally. It's constantly struggling between making maximum profit and following ethical rules. They refuse to invest in tobacco and coal, but they're heavily invested in the same consumer capitalism driving carbon emissions everywhere. But the biggest danger isn't about morals. It's about money. The oil fund has grown so massive, it's not just a savings account anymore. It's become a market monster. It's completely exposed to global stock market ups and downs. In 2022, when markets crashed worldwide, the fund lost $164 billion in just 1 year. That loss was bigger than Norway's entire government budget for the year. Right now, the fund is big enough to absorb these hits, but what happens during a lost decade in stocks? What if the market stays flat for 10 years while Norway's aging population needs more healthcare and pensions? The 3% spending rule assumes markets always rise. If they don't, the math collapses. The government will face an impossible choice: slash the generous welfare system Norwegians believe is their birthright, or break open the piggy bank and start spending the principal. Once they dip into the capital itself, the countdown begins. Wealth meant to last forever could disappear in one generation. This is the trap of living off inherited money. By protecting citizens from harsh economic reality, Norway has weakened its competitive spirit. They've forgotten what it means to be hungry. In the next part, we'll dive into what I call the sick man of Scandinavia problem. We'll examine shocking numbers on sick leave and disability in Norway, the highest anywhere in the world. And we'll ask the tough question: has oil wealth actually made people physically and mentally weaker? We'll look at how the culture shifted from hardworking fishermen to entitled benefit collectors. When economists diagnose Dutch disease, they usually check currency markets. They look for an overvalued currency that kills export industries. But in Norway, the disease has changed form. It's moved from currency markets into people's bodies. To understand what oil wealth really costs, you need to look at a statistic most countries don't talk about. Norway, one of the healthiest, wealthiest, most comfortable societies in human history, is officially the sickest developed nation on Earth. OECD data and government statistics show Norway consistently records the world's highest sickness absence rate. At any moment, roughly 6% to 7% of all workers are calling in sick. That's almost double the rate in Sweden and Denmark, countries with identical climates, similar cultures, and the same genetics. Are Norwegians genetically weaker than Swedes? Obviously not. The difference isn't medical. It's political. Norway has built what's essentially a golden cage of benefits. Under their system, if you get sick, you receive 100% of your salary from day one for up to a year. There's zero financial penalty for staying home. Your employer pays for the first 16 days. After that, the government takes over. This creates backwards incentives where the easiest path is always to opt out. Feeling tired, stressed, or unmotivated? The system pays your full salary to rest at home. In almost every other country, calling in sick has consequences: a waiting period, reduced pay, or risk of getting fired. In Norway, oil wealth has eliminated that friction completely. This has created a new cultural phenomenon centered on one government agency. NAV, the Norwegian Labor and Welfare Administration. NAV is the giant organization managing pensions, unemployment, and sickness benefits. It's so central to Norwegian life it's become a verb. Young Norwegians joke about "why Nave," meaning to take a year off on government benefits to find yourself or play video games. What started as a safety net has hardened into a hammock. A staggering number of working-age people are now on permanent disability. Among 18 to 29-year-olds, the healthiest years of life, people on disability have doubled in the last decade. We're rewatching a generation of dropouts who are physically healthy but mentally checked out of working because the gap between a government check and entry-level wages is too small to bother with a job. This erosion of work ethic is the resource curse in its most personal form. In the 1950s, Norway's character was defined by fishermen and farmers, tough, hard-working people battling the North Sea and rocky soil to survive. They embodied the Protestant work ethic. Today, that cultural strength is dying because oil money broke the connection between effort and survival. When a nation knows the pension fund earns $3,000 every second whether they work or not, the collective drive to perform disappears. This dependency creates massive structural problems. While unemployment looks low on paper, usually 3 to 4%, the real unemployment hides in sick leave and disability numbers. If you counted people on long-term health benefits as unemployed, the rate would jump past 10%, maybe even 15%. This means Norway has a huge labor shortage. The country desperately needs engineers, nurses, and bus drivers, but hundreds of thousands of people sit at home, fully paid by the government. The comparison with neighboring countries is brutal. In the 1990s and 2000s, Sweden and Denmark faced their own economic disasters. They didn't have unlimited oil money for bailouts. They were forced to make hard, unpopular decisions. They cut benefits, added waiting days for sick leave, and tightened disability eligibility. It hurt, but it worked. Today, Swedish and Danish economies are leaner, more dynamic, and have higher real labor participation. They adapted because they had to. Norway, protected by trillions, was allowed to coast. This coasting is incredibly expensive. Norway's government currently spends roughly $60 billion yearly just on the national insurance program. For a country of 5.5 million people, that's enormous. It eats up a huge chunk of oil revenue that's supposed to be saved for future generations. The government is essentially stealing capital from the future to pay for today's laziness. This creates what I call the hamster wheel paradox. Norwegians work fewer hours yearly than almost anyone in the OECD. They have short work weeks, long vacations, and frequent sick leave. They've used oil wealth to buy time. But this purchased leisure hasn't created a renaissance of art, innovation, or culture. Statistics show it's led to rising mental health problems and stagnation. Turns out humans need struggle and purpose to thrive. When a generous oil state removes the struggle, the result isn't happiness. It's comfortable, well-funded emptiness. The terrifying question for Norwegian leaders is, can this be reversed? Once people get used to 100% sick pay, it becomes politically untouchable. Any politician suggesting cuts commits career suicide. Both the right and left in Norway are trapped by oil money. They argue about how to spend it, but nobody dares turn off the tap. They're paralyzed by their own wealth, watching mainland productivity slowly die while the oil fund keeps growing. Walk through Oslo's streets today and you'll feel like you've entered a future utopia. The air is fresh and clean, silent electric ferries cruise the fjord, and streets are filled with Teslas, Polestars, and Audi e-trons. Norway leads the world in electric vehicle adoption, with over 80% of new car sales being fully electric. The country runs almost entirely on clean, renewable hydroelectric power. To any outsider, Norway is the undisputed green champion, a moral leader showing the rest of us how to rescue the planet. But zoom out from Oslo's cafes and fly a few hundred miles north into the rough waters of the North Sea and Barents Sea, and you'll find the dark engine powering this green image. There, massive steel platforms pump millions of barrels of oil and gas daily. Norway isn't just a climate leader. It's the world's 7th largest oil exporter and 3rd largest natural gas exporter. The uncomfortable reality is Norway is basically a sovereign-scale greenwasher. They've achieved carbon neutrality at home by exporting their carbon footprint to everyone else. This creates massive cognitive dissonance at the core of Norwegian identity. The government claims there's no contradiction. They argue Norwegian oil is clean oil, produced with lower emissions per barrel than Middle Eastern or Russian oil. They say selling gas to Europe replaces dirtier coal, but the atmosphere doesn't care about political spin. When Norwegian gas burns in a German or UK power plant, it releases CO2 exactly the same. In climate accounting, this exploits a convenient loophole called Scope 3 emissions. Under the Paris Agreement, countries are responsible for emissions produced inside their borders. They're not responsible for emissions when their exports burn elsewhere. This accounting trick lets Norway claim it's hitting climate targets while simultaneously flooding the atmosphere with carbon. It's like a drug dealer claiming to be a health advocate because he doesn't use his own product, just sells it to neighbors. The hypocrisy peaked recently as traditional North Sea oil fields started running dry. Facing declining revenues, the Norwegian government didn't commit harder to green transition. They committed harder to oil. They pushed exploration deeper north into the fragile Arctic ecosystem. The government issued hundreds of new drilling licenses in the Barents Sea, an area environmentalists say should be protected. This aggressive expansion triggered a historic legal fight. In what's called the climate lawsuit, or Klimasaksmillet, Greenpeace and others sued the Norwegian government, arguing new oil drilling violated Article 112 of Norway's constitution, which guarantees citizens a right to a healthy environment. The case reached the Supreme Court. The environmentalists lost. The court ruled the government could drill. The message was crystal clear. When push comes to shove, Cash flow from offshore oil beats moral climate obligations. But the conflict isn't only about oil. It's also about the green industrialization meant to replace it. Norway wants to become Europe's battery, building massive wind farms to export renewable electricity. However, this crashed violently into the rights of the indigenous Sami people. On a frozen peninsula, the government built one of Europe's largest onshore wind farms. The turbines went up on winter grazing lands, critical for the Sami tradition of reindeer herding. The noise and shadows from spinning blades terrify the animals, destroying herders' livelihoods. The Sami sued, and in a shocking verdict, Norway's Supreme Court ruled the wind farm violated their human rights. The turbines were declared illegal, yet for over 500 days the government did nothing. The illegal turbines kept spinning and electricity kept flowing. It took massive protests, with activists occupying government buildings in Oslo, to force the government to even acknowledge the ruling. This revealed the ruthless practicality hiding beneath the Nordic social democratic smile. In the race to go green, the government was willing to crush the human rights of its own indigenous minority. The green shift, or De Grønne-skiftet, isn't a peaceful evolution. It's a brutal industrial fight where nature and tradition often lose first. This duality creates massive financial risk called stranded assets. Norway's economy is betting on a paradox that the world will fail its climate goals. The Norwegian Petroleum Directorate's forecasts assume strong oil demand into the 2050s. If the world actually succeeds in reaching net zero, oil prices will crash. Norway's massive Arctic drilling investments, projects taking decades to profit, will become worthless losses. The country is essentially betting against the climate. They only profit if the planet keeps burning. If that bet fails and oil revenue dries up faster than expected, Norway's paradox will collapse. The massive welfare state, 100% sick pay, and subsidized Teslas all depend on assuming infinite resource money. When money stops flowing, the social contract breaks. The government, desperate to keep its promises, will hunt for new revenue sources. And when a government can't tax the ground anymore, it starts taxing the people. This brings us to the ultimate vulnerability of modern investors. We live in a world where we assume our safe assets are untouchable. We look at a country like Norway with its perfect credit rating and massive sovereign wealth fund, and we see stability. But history teaches us stability often hides deep structural decay.